So this week, Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak were fined by the police. It makes them the first office holders, respectively, to have been sanctioned by the law while in office. Tom, this Partygate scandal is back with a vengeance. What have you made of it?
I've been slightly more unmoved this time around, I think it's fair to say. I think a lot of us have sort of oscillated wildly between being quite infuriated by the double standards and hypocrisy and all the rest of it, but also quite unmoved by what is ultimately being built up as a big political scandal, but what it's about having birthday cake or some socially distanced drink in a garden, and you kind of move from one to the other. I think with Partygate itself, it was the fact that this started out as a kind of pearl-clutching media campaign, trying to prove it was one rule for them and one rule for us, and kind of often quite kind of inane kind of gotchas over minor breakings of the rules. But when you stack all these things on top of each other, and then you look at some of the more egregious sort of violations, like the party in the number 10 garden at the height of the first lockdown, on the very same day, Oliver Dowden announcing that we can meet one person outside. It was just to the point where it was just an insult to our intelligence. I think the thing that gets missed in all of this, though, is the fact that you've got a media which is hopping mad about this particular issue, talking about it as a constitutional crisis, acting as if this is the worst thing that's ever happened and the most shameful thing that's ever happened in British politics. And yet this is the same media that fundamentally failed to submit the lockdown to any kind of proper scrutiny, if anything, egged it on. They become obsessed with, breaches of these unprecedented rules, but not particularly interested in how these unprecedented rules came about in the first place. And I think that's the place that I end up with all of this, I guess, is that in the end, what's worse, keeping kids out of school, old people having to die alone, criminalising social interaction, or the fact that the people at the top broke the ridiculous rules that they wrote for everyone else is bad, but it's not the biggest issue under the sun, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, Ella, we're talking really about a £50 fine, and yet we've had some people come out and say that this basically calls into question Johnson's unfitness to deal with the war in Ukraine. How can he stand up to Putin if he's a criminal like this? I mean, it has just gone a bit far, hasn't it, some of the reaction?
Well, I think part of the problem is that it has been turned into this question of the PCN, and that completely trivialises it, because obviously, the suggestion that a Prime Minister would, or indeed a Chancellor would resign because they got a talking to by the police and a fixed penalty notice seems ridiculous. And actually, there was a cabinet minister doing the rounds on the radio this morning who was kind of almost sort of chuckling and saying, well, I've had 6 points on my license. We all bend the rules a little bit. We all make mistakes. And he's come out and has apologized and blah, blah, blah. And of course he's right. But that's, as Tom says, that wasn't the point. But the fact that the media has made it about a Prime Minister being cautioned or whatever it is by the police, and the fact that this is the question of the fine, means they ignore all the actual real substance of it, which is that you had politicians laying down law because they believed that the public couldn't be trusted to take sensible decisions, make small risks to pay off, bigger benefits, wear a mask to go see your granny, whatever it is, that they thought we needed really strict restrictions, but that they could make their own decisions. But obviously the reason why the media won't focus on that is because they bought it as well. They were into that extreme lockdown narrative. It was very hard. You have to remember that throughout the last 2 years, it was both very difficult to hear anyone on mainstream media channels criticize lockdown or suggest that there might be a different route to doing this. And those who did got, like Talk Radio, got taken off or banned or slapped with these kind of little posters on social media saying that they were saying something dangerous in relation to COVID regulations. So, I have to admit, it's one of those kind of catch-22 things. I am really angry about it. In a different context, I would want to see heads roll, not because of the birthday cake, but because of the fact of this sort of complete breach of public trust. But it's also the case that, number one, the people who are gunning for Boris Johnson aren't caring about this principle. Lots of them are anti-Brexit people who want to see him gone for a whole different reason. I don't want to give any succor to them. And it's also the case that who would step in his place? I mean, that's the terrible bind that we are in contemporary politics, which is that you have to think about these things. You have to think, well, would I want, Liz Truss or anyone else to be in the prime ministerial position at the moment in the context of war? No, I wouldn't. So for now, stay there.
I noticed she didn't say Rishi. He would have been the obvious candidate just a few months ago.
Yeah.
But it's
now the foreign secretary can't find Russia on a map.
I mean, it's worth thinking, you're talking about the media, gunning for lockdown. I mean, the COVID restrictions and rules and laws only folded at the end of March. I mean, just this Christmas, people were talking about having another lockdown, despite it being, a year on from the vaccine rollout. It's interesting how quickly we forget some of this stuff. I mean, Tom, what have you made of that side of it?
Well, I think there's a lot of kind of amnesia about these things, I suppose. I mean, even in terms of the rules themselves, because they were so confusing. I mean, there's so much latitude even for the police to how they're going to fine you. I mean, the nature of those regulations was such they give an awful lot of discretion to the authorities, which is why the powers were so abused. I mean, you saw all those kind of ridiculous situations of police overreach. And a good example of this is the fact that the number 10 birthday cake, allegedly 10-minute long party for Boris Johnson's birthday, that was briefed to the Times newspaper at the time that it happened. No one batted an eyelid because these things are kind of a bit confusing. So again, there's short memories about a lot of this stuff. I think, but with Partygate, I think it's the sheer volume of it, it's the sheer sort of brazenness of it, and it's the lying basically to kind of pretend that it didn't happen. And I think this, it's genuinely really damaged Johnson. I don't think he can really properly recover from this. It's just contributed to that sense that he's really sort of spent and in it for himself. And then you kind of look around and think, what else is he offering? Net zero. I mean, it doesn't add up to very much. But ultimately, the judgment should be with voters, and it seems like people who don't like him in politics and the media are just desperate to secure a resignation as a way of just getting rid of him without having to bother the electorate with it, which is something which definitely troubles me. I think I have to say that it's as the days roll on in particular, you are just sort of struck by the level of sort of histrionics from the media about this stuff. Talked to, gesturing a bit to it there about them calling it a constitutional crisis and stuff. The journalists who uncovered this running around acting as if they've genuinely uncovered like Watergate or something. I think it's really quite strange. I mean, it speaks to the degradation of journalism to a certain degree, but I think it also speaks to just the nature of political journalism sort of since Brexit and a bit before then, which is that they have become increasingly sort of unhinged a little bit. Brexit just completely scrambled their brains. And so you see them running around acting as if essentially in 2016, Boris Johnson invented lying.
Yeah.
Or that before 2016, all prime ministers were utterly morally unimpeachable and would never do anything as crazy as lie or, mislead anyone or break the law. This might be the first prime minister to be caught breaking the law.
Yeah.
I doubt he was the only one ever to break the law. You see this kind of like faux naivety in relation to all of this stuff. And as a result of that, I think we're just seeing one of those sort of, one of the crescendos of that particular sort of aspects in the media, which is that because Brexit just scrambled their brains so much, they've taken to being incredibly hysterical about absolutely anything Boris Johnson does, which makes it more difficult to criticise him because it's bad, but it's not the worst thing that's ever happened. Let's put it that way.